"You don't belong here." 4 words that sliced through the opulent air of Christie's auction house, sharper than the champagne flutes circulating on silver trays. The security guard's hand firmly gripped the young woman's shoulder, his voice just loud enough for nearby collectors to turn with raised eyebrows and amused smirks. Her vintage dress and paint-stained fingers marked her as an intruder among Rolex watches and custom suits. She wasn't here to buy, she couldn't afford to, yet the fierce determination in her eyes suggested she wouldn't leave without a fight. What no one realized was that her connection to Lot 42 ran deeper than anyone's bank account could measure. The auction hall gleamed under crystal chandeliers, each surface polished to reflect wealth and status. Prospective buyers studied their catalogs with practiced indifference, occasionally glancing at competitors with calculated disinterest. The room smelled of expensive perfume, old money, and the subtle anxiety of those prepared to spend millions on beautiful things they'd rarely look at. In the back row, partially obscured by shadow, a man in a simple black suit observed without expression, his long hair tucked behind his ears. Unlike the others, his attention wasn't on the catalog, but on the confrontation unfolding near the entrance. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, as she reached toward the stage where her soul would soon have a price tag. "That painting is part of me." The guard's grip tightened. The auctioneer adjusted his bow tie with manicured fingers, signaling for security to handle the situation more discreetly. No one expected what would happen next, how a single painting would expose the gap between owning art and understanding it, or how an unexpected voice would silence the room and change everything. The painting that hung on the pristine wall was titled "Remembered Light," a stunning interplay of shadows and illumination, capturing a moment of perfect balance between heartbreak and hope. Critics had praised its raw emotional honesty and technical brilliance beyond the artist's years. What the auction catalog failed to mention was that Eliza Caney had painted it at 22 during the darkest period of her life, using her last canvas and borrowed paints. 6 years ago, desperate for rent money and medical bills, she had sold it for $2,000 to a small gallery owner who recognized talent but exploited desperation. Now estimated at $1.2 to $1.8 million, it represented everything she had lost and might never reclaim. Eliza stood her ground despite the guard's pressure, her eyes never leaving the painting. "I just want to watch," she insisted, pulling from her pocket a crumpled auction paddle number. "I registered. Check your list." The security guard's skepticism showed in his narrowed eyes as he radioed someone at the front desk. The auctioneer glanced over with thinning patience, while wealthy patrons continued their pre-auction rituals, networking, posturing, and silently calculating maximum bids. A woman in diamonds, worth the GDP of a small nation, leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made them both laugh while looking pointedly at Eliza's worn boots. "Let her stay, Charles," came the verdict through the guard's earpiece. "She's registered as paddle 122. The pressure on her shoulder released, but the damage was done. She had been marked as an outsider, someone to be watched. The guard gestured toward the back rows, the section for observers, journalists, and those who couldn't afford to participate in the actual bidding. It was clear from his expression, "You may have the right to be here, but you don't belong." Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Contemporary Masters Evening Sale. The auctioneer's voice carried practiced warmth as he adjusted his microphone. Tonight we have an exceptional collection of 47 works representing the finest emerging and established talents in the global art market. He paused, allowing the weight of the event to settle over the room. Assistants in impeccable suits stood at attention along the walls, phones at the ready for remote bidders whose wealth allowed participation without presence. Eliza slipped into a seat in the back row, clutching her paddle with white knuckles. She had no illusion of winning. The registration fee alone had cost her 3 weeks of tips from the cafe where she worked between teaching community art classes. But she needed to be here to see who would claim her work, to witness this moment when her creation, born from her deepest pain, would become a commodity passing between hands that had never known that kind of suffering. "I've followed your work," said a quiet voice beside her. Eliza turned, startled to find the man with long, dark hair had moved to the seat next to hers. Up close, there was something familiar about him, though she couldn't immediately place it. His eyes held genuine interest, rather than the dismissive glances she'd received from others. "The way you use light, it's honest, vulnerable." Before she could respond, the auctioneer announced, "We'll begin with Lot 36, a captivating piece from the Henderson collection." Eliza calculated quickly. Her painting would be coming up soon, 6 lots away from having her heart auctioned to the highest bidder. The first painting sold for $4.2 million after a brief bidding war between a man in the front row and someone on the phone. The room hummed with energy. This would be a lucrative night for Christie's. "What brings you here for this particular painting?" the man beside her asked, as another lot sold for millions. His voice remained low, respectful of the proceedings, yet unmistakably interested in her answer. Something in his manner made Eliza feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in this room full of people looking right through her. "I painted it," she replied simply, watching his expression closely for the disbelief that usually followed such claims. When it didn't come, words spilled out before she could stop them. "It's the last piece I have any connection to from that period of my life. Everything else is in private collections or lost. This one matters more than the others." Recognition dawned in his eyes, not of her as the artist, but of the deeper truth behind her presence. "You're here to say goodbye," he observed, with unexpected understanding. The auctioneer's voice cut through their conversation. "And now, Lot 42, Remembered Light, by Eliza Kane, a remarkable emergent talent whose work has seen extraordinary appreciation since her New York debut. We'll start the bidding at $800,000. The room shifted subtly as several interested parties straightened in their seats. A dealer known for representing ultra-wealthy Middle Eastern collectors nodded almost imperceptibly. The auctioneer acknowledged with practiced precision, "I have $800,000. Do I hear $900,000? A woman in the third row raised her paddle, then another bid from the phone. Eliza watched, breathless, as her creation's value climbed in $100,000 increments. The painting that had been born from her darkest days, that had cost her tubes of paint she could barely afford, and sleepless nights bent over the canvas, reduced to a luxury good, an investment vehicle, a status symbol for people who would never understand the truth behind each brushstroke. $1.2 million, called the auctioneer, his excitement barely contained beneath professional polish. "Do I hear $1.3 million? The man beside Eliza shifted in his seat. His eyes moved between her face and the painting as the price continued to rise. $1.4 million, announced the auctioneer, his voice rising with the figures. "Do I hear $1.5 million? The paddle from the fourth row shot up without hesitation. The auction house assistant's eyes gleamed with each escalating bid, mentally calculating their commissions. Eliza's painting had officially exceeded its high estimate, and the night was still young. Phone operators spoke in hushed, urgent tones to invisible clients, their expressions carefully neutral despite the mounting excitement. Eliza felt a strange detachment watching the financial tug-of-war over her creation. Each bid higher than the last only widened the chasm between her current reality and the life her art was now living without her. That canvas contained memories no one in this room could see. The apartment where she'd painted it had no heat that winter, forcing her to work in fingerless gloves. The blue in the upper corner came from the last tube of ultramarine she could afford, applied sparingly to make it last. The central figure's posture mirrored her own mother's in the hospital bed before she died, leaving Eliza with the medical bills that eventually forced the painting's sale. "I understand now," the man beside her said, studying her face rather than the auction block. "It's not just any painting, it's the one that got away." His perception was unsettling in its accuracy. Several people nearby turned to look at them, some with annoyed expressions at the whispered conversation, others with sudden recognition in their eyes as they looked at the man. A woman 2 rows ahead did a double-take, then nudged her companion while pointing discreetly. $1.6 million, came a new bid from someone on the phone. The room's energy shifted subtly. They were entering the territory where only the serious collectors remained. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, his keen eyes scanning the room for any sign of another bid. "I sold it for $2,000, Eliza said, her voice barely audible. "6 years ago. I needed to pay my mother's hospice bills. The gallery owner knew I was desperate." She hadn't meant to reveal so much to a stranger, but something about the auction room's rarefied air made her feel like she was floating outside herself, watching this scene unfold from a distance. $1.7 million, called a dealer in the front row, known for representing an anonymous tech billionaire with a fondness for emerging artists. The auctioneer nodded in acknowledgement, his practiced smile widening. "Do I hear $1.8 million?" The auctioneer's gaze swept the room, lingering on known big spenders. $1.7 million once, $1.7 million twice. "Excuse me." The deep voice beside Eliza cut through the auctioneer's practiced rhythm. Heads turned throughout the room as the man stood. Under the crystal chandeliers, there was no mistaking him now. A wave of whispers swept the room. Keanu Reeves was in their midst, and he was interrupting the proceedings. Cell phones appeared in hands, discreetly aimed in his direction, despite the auction house's strict rules about photography. The auctioneer paused, thrown off his cadence, but quickly recovering with professional charm. "Yes, sir? Do you have a bid to place?" He clearly recognized the actor, his tone warming considerably compared to how he'd regarded Eliza. "I'd like to ask a question before this proceeds." Keanu's voice carried easily without being forceful. He had the room's complete attention now. Even those who had been casually scrolling through phones looked up. "The catalog lists this as acquired from a private gallery, but I'm curious about the provenance before that." A flutter of uncertainty passed over the auctioneer's face. "I assure you, sir, all our offerings have been fully authenticated and legally acquired. Christie stands behind—" "That's not what I'm asking," Keanu interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm asking about the ethical provenance, not the legal one." He gestured toward Eliza, who felt the blood drain from her face as dozens of eyes turned to her. This artist sold her work during a time of personal crisis for a fraction of its value. Does that fact not merit acknowledgement before we continue? The room erupted in murmurs. The auctioneer's composed facade cracked slightly as he glanced toward his superiors standing near the exit. A woman in an expensive suit, clearly an auction house executive, stepped forward, her smile strained but determined. "Mr. Reeves, how unexpected and delightful to have you with us tonight," she said smoothly. "While we sympathize with Ms. Kane's situation, I must point out that subsequent sales are the very nature of the art market. Many works change hands at greatly appreciated values. It's what makes art a viable investment vehicle." "Investment vehicle," Keanu repeated, the words hanging in the air. "Is that all we're doing here tonight? Turning human expression into portfolio diversification?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but genuinely questioning, inviting reflection rather than defensiveness. Several collectors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Eliza stood on shaking legs, finding herself the co-center of attention in a room where she'd been invisible moments before. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "And I'm not contesting the sale. I made that choice even if it was under duress. But that painting, her voice caught as she pointed toward the canvas, that painting is the last thing I created while my mother was alive. Her last days are in those brushstrokes. A heavy silence fell over the room. The painting on display seemed to take on new dimensions as people looked at it with fresh eyes, no longer seeing just an investment, but a piece of someone's life, a monument to loss and survival. Perhaps, Keanu suggested, turning to address the room at large, we might consider that art's true value isn't always reflected in its price tag. Sometimes its worth lies in its connection to the human who created it. The auctioneer cleared his throat, visibly thrown by this unexpected turn. "While this is all very moving," he said, struggling to regain control of the proceedings, "we have a contractual obligation to the current owner to proceed with the sale. The bidding stands at $1.7 million. A woman in the fifth row raised her paddle. $1.8 million, she called out, her voice slightly defiant, as if challenging anyone to judge her for continuing with business as usual. $1.9 million, countered the phone bidder immediately. Keanu turned to Eliza, speaking quietly, but with purpose. "If you could have it back, what would you do with it?" The question caught her off guard. She'd never allowed herself to imagine such a possibility. I'd show it in places where people need to see it. Community centers, hospitals, places where people are going through what I went through, not just locked in some penthouse as a tax write-off. He nodded, seeming to come to a decision. Then, to Eliza's astonishment, he raised his paddle. $2 million, he said, his voice clear and confident. The room fell silent again, this time with a different quality. The electric anticipation of celebrity involvement, the unexpected drama unfolding in what should have been a routine auction. The auctioneer's professional mask returned instantly, excitement barely contained at this turn of events. $2 million from Mr. Reeves, he announced with renewed vigor. Do I hear $2.1 million? The tech billionaire's representative consulted his phone briefly, then shook his head. The original phone bidder seemed to hesitate, then offered $2.1 million. Without missing a beat, Keanu raised his paddle again. $2.2 million. The auctioneer could barely contain his satisfaction as the price continued to climb. Eliza stood frozen, watching as her painting, her memories, her pain, her history, became the center of a bidding war involving one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. What had begun as a painful goodbye was transforming into something she couldn't have anticipated, a public recognition of the human story behind the art that no one had cared about until now. $2.5 million, announced the auctioneer, his voice tinged with the thrill of unexpected drama. The room hummed with tension as the bidding had narrowed to just two contenders, Keanu Reeves and the anonymous phone bidder, represented by a composed auction house assistant whose only tell was the whitening of her knuckles around her pen. Eliza felt suspended in unreality, watching numbers that represented decades of her income being casually exchanged over her creation. $2.6 million, came the voice from the phone assistant. Camera phones were now openly recording despite the auction house rules, with social media managers in the back frantically composing posts about the celebrity bidding war unfolding in real time. The auction house executive stood by the wall, her expression a complex mixture of professional satisfaction at the escalating price and concern about the unconventional circumstances driving it. Without hesitation, Keanu raised his paddle again. $2.7 million. His calm demeanor contrasted with the electric atmosphere, his focus unwavering. A small smile crossed his face as he caught Eliza's astonished expression. The other bidders had long since dropped out, watching the battle with the detached interest of spectators at a sporting event. The auctioneer turned expectantly to the phone assistant, who listened intently to her earpiece before nodding. $2.8 million. Eliza swayed slightly on her feet. The figure being discussed was so abstract as to be almost meaningless, more money than she might earn in multiple lifetimes. She thought of her tiny apartment with the leaking ceiling, the art students she taught for barely enough to cover groceries, the stack of medical bills she was still paying off in small monthly installments. And here, in this gilded room, her pain had been transmuted into millions. "May I say something?" Keanu's question redirected all attention back to him. Without waiting for permission, he stood and addressed the room. "I realize this is unorthodox, but I think we need to acknowledge what's really happening here. This isn't just about acquiring an object of beauty or a sound investment." He gestured toward the painting, then to Eliza. "This is about a connection between creator and creation that transcends ownership." A restless murmur ran through the audience. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly uncertain how to proceed with this departure from protocol. "Mr. Reeves, while we appreciate your perspective, we must continue with the established bidding process. The current bid stands at $2.8 million. Do I hear $2.9 million? Keanu remained standing. "Before I place another bid, I'd like to propose something different." His voice carried a gentle authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "What if, instead of continuing this private competition, we consider a different approach to valuing art?" The auction house executive stepped forward, her smile now visibly strained. "Mr. Reeves, while we deeply respect your presence here tonight, I must remind everyone that we operate under contractual obligations to our consigners. This auction must proceed according to our established rules." "I understand," Keanu replied with a respectful nod, "and I'm prepared to honor those obligations. But first, I want everyone in this room to really look, at this painting." He turned toward remembered light, drawing all eyes to the canvas. "When you look at this, do you see a financial asset? Or do you see a human story captured in pigment and preserved in time?" The silence that followed was profound. For perhaps the first time that evening, the assembled collectors actually looked at the artwork rather than its projected value or catalog description. "I see a hospital room," Keanu continued softly. "I see sleepless nights. I see someone transforming grief into beauty." He turned to Eliza. "Am I close?" She nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. "Art isn't just something to own," he continued, addressing the room at large. "It's something to steward, to protect, to share." He paused, letting his words sink in. "So I'd like to ask the current owner, who stands to make a substantial profit tonight, and my fellow bidder on the phone, what are your plans for this painting after you acquire it?" The auction house erupted in uncomfortable shifting and whispered conversations. This was unprecedented, a direct questioning of motives in a space where such things remained politely unexamined. The auctioneer looked toward his superior for guidance, but she appeared equally unsure how to redirect the situation. After a tense moment, the phone assistant spoke. "My client indicates that the piece would join their private collection in their Singapore residence." Keanu nodded, then turned expectantly toward the room, an eyebrow raised in question. "And is your client aware of the painting's significance to its creator? Do they intend to make it accessible to the public in any way?" The phone assistant conferred briefly, then replied with practiced neutrality, "My client values their privacy and the private enjoyment of their collection." "I see," Keanu said simply, before turning back to the auctioneer. $3 million. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The bid had jumped by $200,000 rather than the standard $100,000 increment, a power move that signaled serious intent. The phone assistant listened to her earpiece, her professional composure cracking slightly as she relayed, $3.2 million. Without hesitation, Keanu countered, $3.5 million. The room held its breath as the phone assistant listened intently, her expression shifting subtly before she looked up. "My client has withdrawn from the bidding." The auctioneer could barely contain his excitement as he raised his gavel. 3.5 million once, 3.5 million twice. "Wait," Eliza's voice cut through the room, surprising even herself. All eyes turned to her. With trembling hands but steady voice, she addressed Keanu directly. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Keanu turned to her, his expression open and genuine. "Because art matters, because stories matter, because sometimes the world needs reminders of what value really means." He smiled slightly. "And because I can." The auctioneer, sensing he was losing control of the proceedings again, quickly announced, 3.5 million for the third and final time." The gavel came down with a decisive crack that echoed through the hushed room. "Sold to Mr. Keanu Reeves." A smattering of applause broke out, quickly growing as the room responded to both the record price and the unusual circumstances. Camera phones captured the moment from every angle as Keanu turned to Eliza and extended his hand. "Congratulations," she said automatically, still processing what had just happened. "No," he replied with a gentle smile. "The congratulations belong to you. Your work moved me even before I knew its story." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, offering it to her. "This isn't over yet. Meet me tomorrow morning if you're willing. I think we have more to discuss about your painting's future." The auction house staff had already moved on to the next lot, but no one was paying attention. All eyes remained on the unlikely pair, Hollywood royalty and the struggling artist, standing before a painting that had just become famous, not just for its price tag, but for forcing a room full of the wealthy and powerful to confront the human reality behind the art they collected. As Eliza took the card with trembling fingers, cameras flashed from the back of the room. By morning, their encounter would be trending on every social media platform, transforming a private moment of connection into a public conversation about art, value, and the responsibilities of wealth. But in that moment, all Eliza could focus on was the unexpected possibility that her goodbye to remembered light might not be final after all. The next morning, Eliza stood nervously outside the address Keanu had provided, a sunlit cafe in Chelsea, far from the opulence of Christie's auction house. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening in an endless loop, while social media exploded with videos and commentary. Keanu Auction Hero was trending globally alongside Aşk Remembered Light and Aşk's Eliza Kane. Overnight, her Instagram followers had jumped from a few hundred to over 50,000. 3 galleries had already emailed about representation, and a museum curator had requested an interview. The cafe door opened and Keanu emerged, dressed casually in jeans and a simple black sweater, a stark contrast to his auction suit. "Eliza," he greeted her warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Without the auction house's dramatic lighting and tension, he seemed more human, his famous face softened by genuine warmth. He led her to a quiet corner table where a folder lay waiting. "I still don't understand," Eliza said as they settled into their seats. "Of all the art in that auction, why focus on my painting? Why spend that kind of money for a stranger?" Keanu considered her question thoughtfully. "I collect stories more than objects," he finally said. "When I heard you explain what that painting meant, your mother, that difficult time in your life, it stopped being just another auction lot." He paused as a waitress brought coffee. "Plus, the painting itself is genuinely exceptional. You have a remarkable gift." Eliza wrapped her hands around the warm mug, anchoring herself in the reality of this surreal meeting. Everyone's talking about what happened. About you, about me. She shook her head in disbelief. "My old gallery owner called this morning, the same one who paid me $2,000 for Remembered Light. Suddenly he's interested in my developing career. Keanu smiled at the irony. Fame is a curious currency. It changes values overnight. About the painting, he continued, opening the folder. I had my lawyer draft something this morning. I'd like you to look it over. He slid a document across the table. It's a shared ownership agreement. Eliza's eyes widened as she scanned the paper. I don't understand. It's simple, Keanu explained. Legally, I've purchased the painting. But this agreement establishes that while I maintain ownership, you have perpetual rights to access it, exhibit it, and make decisions about its public display. Additionally, he flipped to the second page, pointing to a clause, I've established a foundation that will tour the painting to the venues you mentioned, hospitals, community centers, places where people might find comfort or inspiration in it. Her hands trembled as she continued reading. And this part about future works? The foundation will fund a series of new paintings from you, exploring similar themes to accompany Remembered Light on its tour. Paid at current market rates, he added, with a meaningful look. Not what someone could pressure you to accept in desperate circumstances. Eliza sat back, overwhelmed. Why go to all this trouble? You could have just enjoyed the painting privately, like any other collector. Keanu leaned forward, his expression earnest. Because art doesn't truly exist in isolation or behind locked doors. Its power comes from being seen, from connecting creator and viewer across time and circumstance. He smiled slightly. I may have paid for it, but we both know the painting was never really for sale, not its essence anyway. 6 months later, Remembered Light hung in the pediatric oncology ward of the hospital where Eliza's mother had spent her final days. Beside it was a new companion piece Eliza had created, titled Continuing Conversations. A plaque explained the painting's journey, from its creation during the artist's period of loss, through its years in private collections, to its dramatic auction, and finally to its current tour. Eliza stood quietly at the back of the hallway, watching as a young resident doctor paused before the paintings, seeking a moment of beauty amidst a difficult shift. A mother emerging from a patient room stopped as well, her exhausted face lifting as she absorbed the interplay of shadow and light, finding perhaps a reflection of her own experience in the brushstrokes. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Keanu. How's the installation going? Alongside it was a photo of the next painting in her new series, now nearly complete, in her new studio, a space she could actually afford with proper lighting and heating. It's where it belongs, she texted back. People who need it can see it. The response came quickly. That's what matters most. Eliza put away her phone and took one last look at her painting, no longer just a commodity with a price tag, but a living connection between artist and viewers, between past pain and present healing. The auction night had transformed not just her career, but her understanding of art's purpose. Wealth could purchase a painting, but it couldn't own the truth behind it. That belonged to everyone who stood before it and found themselves reflected in its depths. As she left the hospital, her phone continued buzzing with notifications. The viral story of Keanu's auction intervention had evolved into something more lasting, a conversation about art's true value, about ethical collecting, about the relationships between artists and their work. What had begun as a painful goodbye to her painting had become a new beginning, not just for Eliza, but for everyone who now questioned what it really meant to own a piece of someone else's soul.